Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, Part 2. Western Civilization to 1914. Chapter 4. The Pattern of Change. In order to obtain perspective, we sometimes divide the culture of a society in a somewhat arbitrary fashion into several different aspects. For example, we can divide a society into 6 aspects: military, political, economic, social, religious, intellectual. Naturally, there are very close connections between these various aspects, and in each aspect there are very close connections between what exists today and what existed in an earlier day. For example, we might want to talk about democracy as a fact on the political level or aspect. In order to talk about it in an intelligent way, we would not only have to know what it is today, we would also have to see what relationship it has to earlier facts on the political level, as well as its relationship to various facts on the other 5 levels of the society. Naturally, we cannot talk intelligently unless we have a fairly clear idea of what we mean by the words we use. For that reason, we shall frequently define the terms we use in discussing this subject. The military level is concerned with the organization of force, the political level with the organization of power, and the economic level with the organization of wealth. By the organization of power in a society, we mean the ways in which obedience and consent or acquiescence are obtained. The close relationships between levels can be seen from the fact that there are 3 basic ways to win obedience: by force, by buying consent with wealth, and by persuasion. Each of these 3 leads us to another level, military, economic, or intellectual, outside the political level. At the same time, the organization of power today, that is, of the methods for obtaining obedience in the society, is a development of the methods used to obtain obedience in the society in an earlier period. These relationships are important because in the 20th century in Western civilization all 6 levels are changing with amazing rapidity, and the relationship between levels are also shifting with great speed. When we add to this confusing picture of Western civilization the fact that other societies are influencing it or being influenced by it, it would seem that the world in the 20th century is almost too complicated to understand. This is indeed true, and we shall have to simplify, perhaps even oversimplify, these complexities in order to reach a low level of understanding. When we have reached such a low level, perhaps we shall be able to raise the level of our understanding by bringing into our minds, little by little, some of the complexities which do exist in the world itself. On the military level in Western civilization in the 20th century, the chief development has been a steady increase in the complexity and the cost of weapons. When weapons are cheap to get and so easy to use that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. Such weapons we call amateur weapons, and such armies we might call mass armies of citizen soldiers. The age of Pericles in classical Greece and the 19th century in Western civilization were periods of amateur weapons and citizen soldiers. But the 19th century was preceded, as was the age of Pericles also, by a period in which weapons were expensive and required long training in their use. Such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the majority who lack them to obey. Thus a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power. A majority can compel a minority to yield, and majority rule or even democratic government tends to rise. The medieval period, in which the best weapon was usually a mounted knight on horseback, clearly a specialist weapon, was a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. Even when the medieval knight was made obsolete, along with his stone castle, by the invention of gunpowder and the appearance of firearms, these new weapons were so expensive and so difficult to use until 1800 that minority rule and authoritarian government continued, even though that government sought to enforce its rule by shifting from mounted knights to professional pikemen and musketeers. But after 1800, guns became cheaper to obtain and easier to use. By 1840, a Colt revolver sold for $27 and a Springfield musket for not much more, and these were about as good weapons as anyone could get at that time. Thus mass armies of citizens, equipped with these cheap and easily used weapons, began to replace armies of professional soldiers, beginning about 1800 in Europe and even earlier in America. At the same time, democratic government began to replace authoritarian governments, but chiefly in those areas where the cheap new weapons were available and local standards of living were high enough to allow people to obtain them. The arrival of the mass army of citizen soldiers in the 19th century created a difficult problem of control, because techniques of transportation and of communications had not been reached a high enough level to allow any flexibility of control in a mass army. Such an army could be moved on its own feet or by railroad. The government could communicate with its various units only by letter post or by telegram. The problem of handling a mass army by such techniques was solved partially in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and completely by Helmut von Moltke for the Kingdom of Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The solution was a rigid one. A plan of campaign was prepared beforehand against a specific opponent, with an established timetable and detailed instructions for each military unit. Communications were prepared and even issued beforehand, to be used according to the timetable. This plan was so inflexible that the signal to mobilize was practically a signal to attack a specified neighboring state, because the plan once initiated could not be changed and could hardly even be slowed up. With this rigid method, Prussia created the German Empire by smashing Austria in 1866 and France in 1871. By 1900, all the states of Europe had adopted the same method and had fixed plans in which the signal for mobilization constituted an attack on some neighbor. A neighbor in some cases, as in the German invasion of Belgium, with whom the attacker had no real quarrel. Thus, when the signal for mobilization was given in 1914, the states of Europe leaped at each other. In the 20th century, the military situation was drastically changed in two ways. On the one hand, communications and transportation were so improved by the invention of the radio and the internal combustion engine that control and movement of troops and even of individual soldiers became very flexible. Mobilization ceased to be equivalent to attack, and attack ceased to be equivalent to total war. On the other hand, beginning with the first use of tanks, gas, high explosive shells, and tactical bombing from the air in 1915 to 1918, and continuing with all the innovations in weapons leading up to the first atomic bomb in 1945, specialist weapons became superior to amateur weapons. This had a double result, which was still working itself out at mid-century. The drafted army of citizen soldiers began to be replaced by a smaller army of professional specialist soldiers, and authoritarian government began to replace democratic government. On the political level, equally profound changes took place in the 20th century. These changes were associated with a basis on which an appeal for allegiance could be placed, and especially with the need to find a basis of allegiance, which could win loyalty over larger and larger areas from more numerous groups of people. In the early Middle Ages, when there had been no state and no public authority, political organization had been the feudal system, which was held together by obligations of personal fealty among a small number of people. With the reappearance of the state and of public authority, new patterns of political behavior were organized in what is called a feudal monarchy. This allowed the state to reappear for the first time since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century, but with restricted allegiance to a relatively small number of persons over a relatively small area. The development of weapons and a steady improvement in transportation and in communications made it possible to compel obedience over wider and wider areas, and made it necessary to base allegiance on something wider than personal fealty to a feudal monarch. Accordingly, the feudal monarchy was replaced by the dynastic monarchy. In this system, subjects owed allegiance to a royal family dynasty, although the real basis of the dynasty rested on the loyalty of a professional army of pikemen and musketeers. The shift from the professional army of mercenaries to the mass army of citizen soldiers, along with other factors acting on other levels of culture, made it necessary to broaden the basis of allegiance once again after 1800. The new basis was nationalism, and gave rise to the national state as the typical political unit of the 19th century. This shift was not possible for the larger dynastic states, which ruled over many different language and national groups. By the year 1900, 3 old dynastic monarchies were being threatened with disintegration by the rising tide of nationalistic agitation. These 3, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire of the Romanovs, did disintegrate as a consequence of the defeats of the First World War. But the smaller territorial units which replaced them, states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Lithuania, organized largely on the basis of language groups, may have reflected adequately enough the nationalistic sentiments of the 19th century, but they reflected very inadequately the developments in weapons, in communications, in transportation, and in economics of the 20th century. By the middle of this latter century, these developments were reaching a point where states which could produce the latest instruments of coercion were in a position to compel obedience over areas much larger than those occupied by people speaking the same language or otherwise regarding themselves as sharing a common nationality. Even as early as 1940, it began to appear that some new basis, more continental in scope than existing nationality groups, must be found for the new superstates which were beginning to be born. It became clear that the basis of allegiance for these new superstates of continental scope must be ideological rather than national. Thus the 19th century's national state began to be replaced by the 20th century's ideological bloc. At the same time, the shift from amateur to specialist weapons made it likely that the new form of organization would be authoritarian rather than democratic, as the earlier national state had been. However, the prestige of Britain's power and influence in the 19th century was so great in the first third of the 20th century that the British parliamentary system continued to be copied everywhere that people were called upon to set up a new form of government. This happened in Russia in 1917, in Turkey in 1908, in Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1918 to 1919, and in most of the states of Asia, such as China, in 1911. When we turn to the economic level, we turn to a series of complex developments. It would be pleasant if we could just ignore these, but obviously we cannot, because economic issues have been of paramount importance in the 20th century, and no one can understand the period without at least a rudimentary grasp of the economic issues. In order to simplify these somewhat, we may divide them into four aspects: A. Energy, B. Materials, C. Organization, and D. Control. It is quite clear that no economic goods can be made without the use of energy and of materials. The history of the former falls into two chief parts, each of which is divided into two subparts. The main division, about 1830, separates an earlier period when production used the energy delivered through living bodies, and a later period when production used energy from fossil fuels delivered through engines. The first half is subdivided into an earlier period of manpower and slavery, and a later period using the energy of draft animals. This subdivision occurred roughly about AD 1000. The second half, since 1830, is subdivided into a period which used coal in steam engines, and a period which used petroleum in internal combustion engines. This subdivision occurred about 1900, or a little later. The development of the use of materials is familiar to everyone. We can speak of an age of iron before 1830, an age of steel 1830 to 1910, and an age of alloys, light metals and synthetics since 1910. Naturally, all these dates are arbitrary and approximate, since the different periods commenced at different dates in different areas, diffusing outward from their origin the core area of Western civilization in northwestern Europe. When we turn to the developments which took place in economic organization, we approach a subject of great significance. Here again we can see a sequence of several periods. There were 6 of these periods, each with its own typical form of economic organization. At the beginning, in the early Middle Ages, Western civilization had an economic system which was almost entirely agricultural, organized in self-sufficient manners, with almost no commerce or industry. To this manorial agrarian system there was added, after about 1050, a new economic system based on trade in luxury goods of remote origin for the sake of profits. This we might call commercial capitalism. It had 2 periods of expansion, one in the period 1050 to 1270, and the other in the period 1440 to 1890. The typical organization of these 2 periods was the trading company. In the second we might say the chartered trading company, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, or the various East India Companies. The next period of economic organization was the stage of industrial capitalism, beginning about 1770, and characterized by owner management through the single proprietorship or the partnership. The third period we might call financial capitalism. It began about 1850, reached its peak about 1914, and ended about 1932. Its typical forms of economic organization were the limited liability corporation and the holding company. It was a period of financial or banker management rather than one of owner management, as in the earlier period of industrial capitalism. This period of financial capitalism was followed by a period of monopoly capitalism. In this fourth period, typical forms of economic organization were cartels and trade associations. This period began to appear about 1890. took over control of the economic system from the bankers about 1932, and is distinguished as a period of managerial dominance in contrast with the owner management and the financial management of the two periods immediately preceding it. Many of its characteristics continue even today, but the dramatic events of World War II and the post-war period put it in such a different social and historical context as to create a new sixth period of economic organization, which might be called the pluralist economy. The features of this sixth period will be described later. The approximate relationship of these various stages may be seen in the following table. Then there's a table of what we have said. First, we will read these economic systems. Manorial dates 672 later. Typical organization is a manner. Management is custom. Commercial capitalism, 2 ages of expansion from 1050 to 1270 and from 1440 to 1690. Typical organization is company or chartered company. Management is municipal mercantilism or state mercantilism. Then we have industrial capitalism from 1770 to 1870. Typical organization is private firm or partnership. Management is by the owners. Financial capitalism lasted from 1850 to 1932. Typical organization is corporation and holding company. Management is by bankers. Monopoly capitalism came from 1890 to 1950. Typical organization is cartels and trade associations. Management is by managers. Pluralist economy is from 1934 to present. Typical organization, lobbying groups. Management by technocrats. 2 things should be noted. In the first place, these various stages or periods are additive in a sense, and there are many survivals of earlier stages into later ones. As late as 1925 there was a manor still functioning in England, and Cecil Rhodes Chartered Company, which opened up Rhodesia, the British South Africa Company, was chartered as late as 1889. In the same way, owner-managed private firms engaging in industrial activities or corporation and holding companies engaging in financial activities could be created today. In the second place, all the later periods are called capitalism. This term means an economic system motivated by the pursuit of profits within a price system. The commercial capitalist sought profits from the exchange of goods. The industrial capitalist sought profits from the manufacture of goods. Financial capitalists sought profits from the manipulation of claims on money, and the monopoly capitalism sought profits from manipulation of the market to make the market price and the amount sold such that his profits will be maximized. It is interesting to note that as a consequence of these various stages of economic organization, Western civilization has passed through 4 major stages of economic expansion, marked by the approximate dates 1970 to 1270, 1440 to 1690, 1770 to 1982, to 1922, and since 1950. 3 of these stages of expansion were followed by the outbreak of imperialist wars, as the stage of expansion reached its conclusion. These were the 100 Years' War and the Italian Wars, 1338 to 1445, 1949 to 1494 to 1559, the Second 100 Years' War, 1667 to 1815, and the World Wars, 1914 to 1945. The economic background of the third of these will be examined later in this chapter, but now we must continue our general survey of the conditions of Western civilization in regard to other aspects of culture. One of these is the 4th and last portion of the economic level, that concerned with economic control. Economic control has passed through 4 stages in Western civilization. Of these, the first and third were periods of automatic control, in the sense that there was no conscious effort at a centralized system of economic control, while the second and fourth stages were periods of conscious efforts at control. These stages with approximate dates were as follows: automatic control, manorial custom, 1650 to 1150; conscious control, municipal mercantilism, 1150 to 1450; state mercantilism from 1450 to 1815; automatic control, laissez-faire in the competitive market, 1815 to 1934; conscious control, planning, both public and private, 1934 to the present. Now here I must comment that he is here talking only about the economic system of the Western powers, that means Britain and America and British colonies. This does not apply, in my opinion, to continental Europe, to Russia or to China or to Africa. It should be evident that these 5 stages of economic control are closely associated with the stages previously mentioned in regard to kinds of weapons on the military level or the forms of government on the political level. The same 5 stages of economic control have a complex relationship to the 6 stages of economic organization already mentioned. The important stage of industrial capitalism, overlapping the transition from state mercantilism to laissez-faire. When we turn to the social level of a culture, we can note a number of different phenomena, such as changes in growth of population, changes in aggregates of this population, such as rise or decline of cities, and changes in social classes. Most of these things are far too complicated for us to attempt to treat them in any thorough fashion here. We have already discussed the various stages in population growth, and shown that Europe was, about 1900, generally passing from a stage of population growth with many persons in the prime of life, type B, to a stage of population stabilization with a larger percentage of middle-aged persons, type C. This shift from type B to type C population in Europe can be placed most roughly at the time that the 19th century gave rise to the 20th century. At about the same time or shortly after, and closely associated with the rise of monopoly capitalism, with its emphasis on automobiles, telephones, radio and such, was a shift in the aggregation of population. This shift was from the period we might call the rise of the city, in which year by year a larger proportion of the population lived in cities, to what we might call the rise of the suburbs, or even the period of megapolis, in which the growth of residential concentration moved outward from the city itself into the surrounding area. The third aspect of the social level to which we might turn our attention is concerned with changes in social classes. Each of the stages in the development of economic organization was accompanied by the rise to prominence of a new social class. The medieval system had provided a feudal nobility based on the manorial agrarian system. The growth of commercial capitalism in 2 stages gave a new class of commercial bourgeoisie. The growth of industrial capitalism gave rise to 2 new classes, the industrial bourgeoisie and the industrial workers, or proletariat, as they were sometimes called in Europe. The development of financial and monopoly capitalism provided a new group of managerial technicians. The distinction between industrial bourgeoisie and managers essentially rests on the fact that they form a control industry and possess power because they are owners, while managers control industry and also government or labor unions or public opinion because they are skilled or trained in certain techniques. As we shall see later, the shift from one to the other was associated with a separation of control from ownership in economic life. The shift was also associated with what we might call a change from a two-class society to a middle-class society. Under industrial capitalism and the early part of financial capitalism, society began to develop into a polarized two-class society in which an entrenched bourgeoisie stood opposite to a mass proletariat. It was on the basis of this development that Karl Marx, about 1850, formed his ideas of an inevitable class struggle in which the group of owners would become fewer and richer, while the mass of workers became poorer and poorer, but more and more numerous, until finally the mass would rise up and take ownership and control from the privileged minority. By 1900, social developments took a direction so different from that expected by Marx that his analysis became almost worthless, and his system had to be imposed by force in a most backward industrial country, Russia, instead of occurring inevitably in the most advanced industrial country as he had expected. The social developments which made Marx's theories obsolete were the result of technological and economic developments which Marx had not foreseen. The energy for production was derived more and more from inanimate sources of power and less from human labor. As a result, mass production required less labor, but mass production required mass consumption, so that the products of the new technology had to be distributed to the working groups as well as to others, so that rising standards of living for the masses made the proletariat fewer and richer and richer. At the same time, the need for managerial and white-collar workers of the middle levels of the economic system raised the proletariat into the middle class in large numbers. The spread of the corporate form of industrial enterprise allowed control to be separated from ownership, and allowed the latter to be dispersed over a much wider group, so that in effect owners became more and more numerous and poorer, and finally control shifted from owners to managers. The result was that the polarized two-class society envisaged by Marx was after 1900 increasingly replaced by a mass middle-class society, with fewer poor, and if not fewer rich, at least a more numerous group of rich, who were relatively less rich than in an earlier period. This process of leveling up the poor and leveling down the rich originated in economic forces, but was speeded up and extended by governmental policies in regard to taxation and social welfare, especially after 1945. When we turn to the higher levels of culture, such as the religious and intellectual aspects, we can discern a sequence of stages similar to theirs which have been found in the more material levels. We shall make no extended examination of these at this time, except to say that the religious level has seen a shift from a basically secularist, materialist, and anti-religious outlook in the late 19th century to a much more spiritualist and religious point of view in the course of the 20th century. At the same time, a very complex development on the intellectual level has shown a profound shift in outlook from an optimistic and scientific point of view in the period 1860 to 1890 to a much more pessimistic and irrationalist point of view in the period following 1890. This shift in point of view, which began in a rather restricted group forming an intellectual vanguard about 1890, a group which included such figures as Freud, Sorel, Bergson, and Proust, spread downward to larger and larger sections of Western society in the course of the new century as a result of the devastating experience of the two world wars and the Great Depression. The results of this process can be seen in the striking contrast between the typical outlook of Europe in the 19th century and in the 20th century as outlined in the preceding chapter. These efforts were accelerated with the shift of commercial capitalism into mercantilism and the destruction of the whole pattern of social organization based on dynastic monarchy, professional mercenary armies, and mercantilism in the series of wars which shook Europe from the middle of the 17th century to 1815. Commercial capitalism passed through two periods of expansion, each of which deteriorated into a later phase of war, class struggles, and retrogression. The first stage, associated with the Mediterranean Sea, was dominated by the North Italians and Catalonians, but ended in a phase of crisis after 1300, which was not finally ended until 1558. The second stage of commercial capitalism, which was associated with the Atlantic Ocean, was dominated by West Iberians, the Netherlanders, and the English. It had begun to expand by 1440, was in full swing by 1600, and by the end of the 17th century had become entangled in the restrictive struggles of state mercantilism and a series of wars which ravaged Europe from 1667 to 1850. Supremacy of charter companies. The commercial capitalism of the 1440 to 1815 period was marked by the supremacy of the chartered companies, such as the Hudson's Bay, the Dutch and British East Indian Companies, the Virginia Company, and the Association of Merchant Adventurers, Muscovy Company. England's greatest rivals in all these activities were defeated by England's greater power, and above all its greater security derived from its insular position. Industrial capitalism, 1770 to 1850. Britain's victories over Louis XIV in the period 1667 to 1715, and over the French revolutionary governments and Napoleon in 1792 to 1815 had many causes, such as its insular position, its ability to retain control of the sea, its ability to present itself to the world as the defender of the freedoms and rights of small nations, and of diverse social and religious groups. Among these numerous causes, there were a financial one and an economic one. Financially, England had discovered the secret of credit. Economically, England had embarked on the Industrial Revolution. The founding of the Bank of England is one of the great dates in world history. Credit had been known to the Italians and Netherlanders long before it became one of the instruments of English world supremacy. Nevertheless, the founding of the Bank of England by William Paterson and his friends in 1694 is one of the great dates in world history. For generations, men had sought to avoid the one drawback of gold, its heaviness, by using pieces of paper to represent specific pieces of gold. Today we call such pieces of paper gold certificates. Such a certificate entitles its bearer to exchange it for its piece of gold on demand. But in view of the convenience of paper, only a small fraction of certificate holders ever did make such demands. It early became clear that gold need be held on hand only to the amount needed to cover the fraction of certificates likely to be presented for payment. Accordingly, the rest of the gold could be used for business purposes, or what amounts to the same thing, a volume of certificates could be issued greater than the volume of gold reserved for payment of demands against them. Such an excess volume of paper claims against reserves we now call banknotes. Bankers create money out of nothing. In effect, this creation of paper claims greater than the reserves available means that bankers were creating money out of nothing. The same thing could be done in another way, not by note-issuing banks, but by deposit banks. Deposit bankers discovered that orders and checks drawn against deposits by depositors and given to third persons were often not cashed by the latter, but were deposited to their own accounts. Thus there were no actual movements of funds, and payments were made simply by bookkeeping transactions on the accounts. Accordingly, it was necessary for the banker to keep on hand in actual money, gold, certificates and notes, no more than a fraction of deposits likely to be drawn upon and cashed. The rest could be used for loans, and if these loans were made by creating a deposit for the borrower, who in turn would draw checks upon it rather than withdraw it in money, such created deposits or loans could also be covered adequately by retaining reserves to only a fraction of their value. Such created deposits also were a creation of money out of nothing, although bankers usually refuse to express their actions, either note issuing or deposit lending, in these terms. William Paterson, however, on obtaining the charter of the Bank of England in 1694, to use the moneys he had won in privateering, said, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing." This was repeated by Sir Edward Holden, founder of the Midland Bank, on December 18, 1907, and is of course generally admitted today. The creation of credit. This organizational structure for creating means of payment out of nothing, which we call credit, was not invented by England, but was developed by her to become one of her chief weapons in the victory over Napoleon in 1815. The Emperor, as the last great mercantilist, could not see money in any but concrete terms, and was convinced that his efforts to fight wars on the basis of sound money, by avoiding the creation of credit, would ultimately win him a victory by bankrupting England. He was wrong, although the lesson has had to be relearned by modern financiers in the 20th century. Britain's victory over Napoleon. Britain's victory over Napoleon was also helped by two economic innovations: the agricultural revolution, which was well established there in 1720, and the industrial revolution, which was equally well established there by 1776, when Watt patented his steam engine. The Industrial Revolution, like the Credit Revolution, has been much misunderstood, both at the time and since. This is unfortunate, as each of these has great significance, both to advanced and to underdeveloped countries in the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution was accompanied by a number of incidental features, such as growth of cities through the factory system, the rapid growth of an unskilled labor supply, the proletariat, the reduction of labor to the status of a commodity in the competitive market, and the shifting of ownership of tools and equipment from laborers to a new social class of entrepreneurs. None of these constituted the essential feature of industrialism, which was in fact the application of non-living power to the productive process. This application, symbolized in the steam engine and the water wheel, in the long run served to reduce or eliminate the relative significance of unskilled labor and the use of human or animal energy in the productive process, automation, and to disperse the productive process from cities, but did so throughout by intensifying the vital feature of the system, the use of energy from sources other than living bodies. the rise of large industrial enterprises in Britain. In this continuing process, Britain's early achievement of industrialism gave it such great profits that these, combined with the profits derived earlier from commercial capitalism and the simultaneous profits derived from the unearned rise in land values from new cities and mines, made its early industrial enterprises largely self-financed, or at least locally financed. They were organized in proprietorships and partnerships, had contact with local deposit banks for short-term current loans, but had little to do with international bankers, investment banks, central governments, or cooperative forms of business organization. This early stage of industrial capitalism, which lasted in England from about 1770 to about 1850, was shared to some extent with Belgium and even France, but took quite different forms in the United States, Germany and Italy, and almost totally different forms in Russia or Asia. The chief reason for these differences was the need for raising funds, capital, to pay for the rearrangement of the factors of production, land, labor, materials, skill, equipment, and so on, which industrialism required. Northwestern Europe, and above all England, had large savings for such new enterprises. Central Europe and North America had much less, while Eastern and Southern Europe had very little in private hands. The role of the international investment banker. The more difficulty an area had in mobilizing capital for industrialization, the more significant was the role of investment bankers and of governments in the industrial process. In fact, the early forms of industrialism based on textiles, iron, coal, and steam spread so slowly from England to Europe that England was itself entering upon the next stage, financial capitalism, by the time Germany and the United States, about 1850, were just beginning to industrialize. This new stage of financial capitalism, which continued to dominate England, France, and the United States as late as 1930, was made necessary by the great mobilizations of capital needed for railroad building after 1830. The capital needed for railroads, with their enormous expenditures on track and equipment, could not be raised from single proprietorships or partnerships or locally, but instead required a new form of enterprise, the limited liability stock corporation, and a new source of funds, the international investment banker who had until then concentrated his attention almost entirely on international flotations of government bonds. The demands on railroads for equipment carried this same development almost at once into steel manufacturing and coal mining. Financial capitalism, 1850 to 1931. This third stage of capitalism is of such overwhelming significance in the history of the 20th century, and its ramifications and influences have been so subterranean and even occult, that we may be excused if we devote considerate attention to its organization and methods. Essentially what it did was to take the old disorganized and localized methods of handling money and credit and organize them into an integrated system on an international basis, which worked with incredible and well-oiled facility for many decades. The center of that system was in London, with major offshoots in New York and Paris, and it has left as its greatest achievement an integrated banking system and a heavily capitalized, if now largely obsolescent framework of heavy industry reflected in railroads, steel mills, coal mines, and electrical utilities. This system had its center in London for four chief reasons. First was a great volume of savings in England, resting on England's early successes in commercial and industrial capitalism. Second was England's oligarchic social structure, especially as reflected in its concentrated land ownership and limited access to educational opportunities, which provided a very inequitable distribution of incomes, with large surpluses coming to the control of a small, energetic upper class. Third was the fact that this upper class was aristocratic but not noble, and thus based on traditions rather than birth, was quite willing to recruit both money and ability from lower levels of society and even from outside the country, welcoming American heiresses and Central European Jews to its ranks, almost as willingly as it welcomed moneyed, able, and conformist recruits from the lower classes of Englishmen, whose disabilities from educational deprivation, provincialism, and nonconformist, that is, non-Anglican, religious background generally excluded them from the privileged aristocracy. Fourth, and by no means last in significance, was the skill in financial manipulation, especially on the international scene, which the small group of merchant bankers of London had acquired in the period of commercial and industrial capitalism, and which lay ready for use when the need for financial capitalist innovation became urgent. The dynasties of international bankers. The merchant bankers of London had already at hand in 1810 to 1850 the Stock Exchange, the Bank of England, and the London money market, when the needs of advancing industrialism called all of these into the industrial world, which they had hitherto ignored. In time they brought into their financial network the provincial banking centres, organized as commercial banks and savings banks, as well as insurance companies, to form all of these into a single financial system on an international scale, which manipulated the quantity and flow of money, so that they were able to influence, if not control, governments on one side and industries on the other. The men who did this, looking backwards toward the period of dynastic monarchy, in which they had their own roots, aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers, and were at least as successful at this as were many of the dynastic political rulers. The greatest of these dynasties, of course, were the descendants of Mayor Amschel Rothschild, 1743 to 1812, of Frankfurt, whose male descendants for at least 2 generations generally married first cousins or even nieces. Rothschild's 5 sons established its branches in Vienna, London, Naples, and Paris, as well as Frankfurt, cooperated together in ways which other international banking dynasties copied but rarely excelled. The financial activities of international bankers. In concentrating as we must on the financial or economic activities of international bankers, we must not totally ignore their own attributes. They were, especially in later generations, cosmopolitan rather than nationalistic. They were usually highly civilized, cultured gentlemen, patrons of education and of the arts, so that today colleges, professorships, opera companies, symphonies, libraries, and museum collections still reflect their munificence. For these purposes they set a pattern of endowed foundations which still surround us today. The key international banking families. The names of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, Despairs, Mirabeau, Mallet, Fou, and above all Rothschild and Morgan. Even after these banking families became fully involved in domestic industry by the emergence of financial capitalism, they remained different from ordinary bankers in distinctive ways. They were cosmopolitan and international. 2, they were close to governments and were particularly concerned with questions of government debts, including foreign government debts, even in areas which seemed at first glance poor risks. like Egypt, Persia, Ottoman Turkey, Imperial China, and Latin America. 3. Their interests were almost exclusively in bonds and very rarely in goods, since they admired liquidity and regarded commitments in commodities or even real estate as the first step toward bankruptcy. They were, accordingly, fanatical devotees of deflation. 4. They were accordingly fanatical devotees of deflation, which they called sound money from its close associations with high interest rates and a high value of money, and of the gold standard, which in their eyes symbolized and ensured these values. And 5. They were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers, and more particularly were known as merchant bankers in England, private bankers in France, and investment bankers in the United States. In all countries they carried on various kinds of banking and exchange activities, but everywhere they were sharply distinguishable from other more obvious kinds of banks, such as savings banks or commercial banks. The international banking fraternity operates as secretive private firms. One of their less obvious characteristics was that they remained as private unincorporated firms, usually partnerships, until relatively recently, offering no shares, no reports, and usually no advertising to the public. This risky status, which deprived them of limited liability, was retained in most cases until modern inheritance taxes made it essential to surround such family wealth with the immortality of corporate status for tax avoidance purposes. This persistence as private firms continued because it ensured the maximum of anonymity and secrecy to persons of tremendous public power who dreaded public knowledge of their activities as an evil almost as great as inflation. As a consequence, ordinary people had no way of knowing the wealth or areas of operation of such firms, and often were somewhat hazy as to their membership. Thus people of considerable political knowledge might not associate the names Walter Burns, Clinton Dawkins, Edward Grenfell, Willard Straight, Thomas Lamont, Dwight Morrow, Nelson Perkins, Russell Effingwell, Elihu Root, John W. Davis, John Foster Dulles, and S. Parker Gilbert, with the name Morgan. Yet all these, and many others, were parts of the system of influence which centered on the J.P. Morgan office at 3 Wall Street. This firm, like others on the international banking fraternity, constantly operated through corporations and governments, yet remained itself an obscure private partnership until international financial capitalism was passing from its deathbed to the grave. J.P. Morgan and Company, originally founded in London as Joe Peabody and Company in 1838, was not incorporated until March 21, 1940, and went out of existence as a separate entity on April 24, 1959, when it merged with its most important commercial bank subsidiary, the Guarantee Trust Company. A London affiliate, Morgan Grenfell, was incorporated and still exists. International bankers felt politicians could not be trusted with control of the monetary system. The influence of financial capitalism and of the international bankers who created it was exercised both on businesses and on governments, but could have done neither of it had not been able to persuade both these to accept 2 axioms of its own ideology. Both of these were based on the assumption that politicians were too weak and too subject to temporary popular pressures to be trusted with control of the money system. Accordingly, the sanctity of all values and the soundness of money must be protected in 2 ways: by basing the value of money on gold, and by allowing bankers to control the supply of money. To do this, it was necessary to conceal or even to mislead both governments and people about the nature of money and its methods of operation. The gold standard. For example, bankers called the process of establishing a monetary system on gold stabilization, and imply that this covered as a single consequence stabilization of exchanges and stabilization of prices. It really achieved only stabilization of exchanges, while its influence on prices were quite independent and incidental, and might be unstabilizing, from its usual tendency to force prices downward by limiting the supply of money. As a consequence, many persons, including financiers and even economists, were astonished to discover in the 20th century that the gold standard gave stable exchanges and unstable prices. It had, however, already contributed to a similar but less extreme situation in much of the 19th century. Exchanges were stabilized on the gold standard because by law in various countries the monetary unit was made equal to a fixed quantity of gold, and the two were made exchangeable at that legal ratio. In the period before 1914, currency was stabilized in certain countries as follows. In Britain, 77 shillings 10.5 pence equaled a standard ounce, 11/12 of pure gold. In the United States, $20.67 equaled a fine ounce, 1 ounce of pure gold. In France, 3,447.74 francs equaled a fine kilogram of gold. In Germany, 2,790 marks equaled a fine kilogram of gold. These relationships were established by the legal requirement that a person who brought gold coins or certificates to the public treasury or other designated places could convert any of those into either of the others in unlimited amounts for no cost. As a result, on a full gold standard, gold had a unique position. It was at the same time in the sphere of money and in the sphere of wealth. In the sphere of money, the value of all other kinds of money was expressed in terms of gold, and in the sphere of real wealth, the values of all other kinds of goods were expressed in terms of gold as money. If we regard the relationship between money and goods as a seesaw, in which each of these was at opposite ends, so that the value of one rose just as much as the value of the other declined, then we must see gold as the fulcrum of the seesaw on which this relationship balances, but which does not itself go up or down. It is impossible to understand world history without an understanding of money. Since it is quite impossible to understand the history of the 20th century without some understanding of the role played by money in domestic affairs and in foreign affairs, as well as the role played by bankers in economic life and in political life, we must take at least a glance at each of these four subjects. Central banks were private institutions owned by shareholders. In each country, the supply of money took the form of an inverted pyramid or cone, balanced on its point. In the point was a supply of gold and its equivalent certificates. On the intermediate levels was a much larger supply of notes, and at the top, with an open and expendable upper surface, was an even greater supply of deposits. Each level used the levels below as its reserves, and since these lower levels and smaller quantities of money had smaller quantities of money, they were, quote, sounder. A holder of claims on the middle or upper level could increase his confidence in his claims on wealth by reducing them to a lower level, although, of course, if everyone or any considerable number of persons tried to do this at the same time, the volume of reserves would be totally inadequate. Notes were issued by banks of emission or banks of issue, and were secured by reserves of gold or certificates held in their own coffers or in some central reserve. The fraction of such a note issue held in reserve depended upon custom, banking regulations, including the terms of a bank's charter, or statute law. There were formerly many banks of issue, but this function is now generally restricted to a few or even to a single central bank in each country. Such banks, even central banks, were private institutions, owned by shareholders who profited by their operations. In the 1914 to 1939 period in the United States, Federal Reserve notes were covered by gold certificates to 40% of their value, but this was reduced to 25% in 1945. The Bank of England, by an Act of 1928, had its notes uncovered up to $250 million and covered by gold for 1% value over that amount. The Bank of France in the same year set its note cover at 35%. These provisions could always be set aside or changed in an emergency such as war. The deposits on the upper level of the pyramid were called by this name, with typical bankers' ambiguity, in spite of the fact that they consisted of two utterly different kinds of relationships. One, lodged deposits, which were real claims left by a depositor in a bank, on which the depositor might receive interest, since such deposits were debts owed by the bank to the depositor, and two, created deposits, which were claims created by the bank out of nothing, as loans from the bank to depositors, who had to pay interest on them, since these represented debt from them to the bank. In both cases, of course, checks could be drawn against such deposits to make payments to third parties, which is why both were called by the same name. Both form part of the money supply. Lodged deposits as a form of savings are deflationary, while created deposits, being in addition to the money supply, are inflationary. The volume of the latter depends on a number of factors, of which the chief are the rate of interest and the demand for such credit. These two play a very significant role in determining the volume of money in the community, since a large proportion of that volume in an advanced economic community is made up of checks drawn against these deposits. The volume of deposits banks can create, like the amount of notes they can issue, depends upon the volume of reserves available to pay whatever fraction of checks are cashed, rather than deposited. These matters may be regulated by laws, by bankers' rules, or simply by local customs. In the United States, deposits were traditionally limited to 10 times reserves of notes and gold. In Britain it was usually nearer 20 times such reserves. In all countries, the demand for and volume of such credit was larger in time of a boom and less in time of a depression. This, to a considerable extent, explains the inflationary aspect of a depression, the combination helping to form the so-called business cycle. Central banks surrounded by invisible private investment banking firms. In the course of the 19th century, with the full establishment of the gold standard and of the modern banking system, there grew up around the fluctuating inverted pyramid of the money supply a plethora of financial establishments which came to assume the configurations of a solar system, that is, of a central bank surrounded by satellite financial institutions. In most countries, the central bank was surrounded closely by the almost invisible private investment banking firms. These, like the planet Mercury, could hardly be seen in the dazzle emitted by the central bank, which they in fact often dominated. Yet a close observer could hardly fail to notice the close private associations between these private international bankers and the central bank itself. In France, for example, in 1936, when the Bank of France was reformed, its Board of Regents directors was still dominated by the names of the families who had originally set it up in 1800. To these had been added a few more recent names, such as Rothschild, added in 1819. In some cases, the name might not be readily recognized, because it was that of a son-in-law rather than that of a son. Otherwise, in 1914, the names, frequently those of Protestants of Swiss origin, who arrived in the 18th century, or the Jews of German origin, who arrived in the 19th century, had been much the same for more than a century. The Bank of England and its private banking firms. In England, a somewhat similar situation existed, so that even in the middle of the 20th century the members of the court of the Bank of England were chiefly associates of the various old merchant banking firms, such as Baring Brothers, Morgan Grenfell, Lazard Brothers, and others. In a secondary position outside the central core are the commercial banks, called in England the joint stock banks, and on the continent frequently known as deposit banks. These include such famous names as Midland Bank, Lloyds Bank, Barclays Bank in England, the National City Bank in the United States, the Crédit Lyonnais in France, and the Darmstädter Bank in Germany. Outside this secondary ring is a third, more peripheral assemblage of institutions that have little financial power but do have the very significant function of mobilizing funds from the public. This includes a wide variety of savings banks, insurance firms, and trust companies. Naturally, these arrangements vary greatly from place to place, especially as the division of banking functions and powers are not the same in all countries. In France and England, the private bankers exercised their powers through the central bank and had much more influence on the government and on foreign policy and much less influence on industry, because in these two countries, unlike Germany, Italy, and the United States, or Russia, private savings were sufficient to allow much of industry to finance itself without recourse either to bankers or government. In the United States, much industry was financed by investment bankers directly, and the power of these both on industry and on government was very great. While the central bank, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, was established late 1913 and became powerful much later after financial capitalism was passing from the sea. In Germany, industry was financed and controlled by the discount banks, while the central bank was of little power of significance before 1914. In Russia, the role of the government was dominant in much of economic life, while in Italy the situation was backward and complicated. We have said that two of the five factors which determine the value of money, and thus the price level of goods, are the supply and the demand for money. The supply of money in a single country was subject to no centralized, responsible control in most countries over recent centuries. Instead, there were a variety of controls, of which some could be influenced by bankers, some could be influenced by the government, and some could hardly be influenced by either. Thus the various parts of the pyramid of money were but loosely related to each other. Moreover, much of this looseness arose from the fact that the controls were compulsive in a deflationary direction and were only permissive in an inflationary direction. This last point can be seen in the fact that the supply of gold could be decreased but could hardly be increased. If an ounce of gold was added to the point of the pyramid in a system where law and custom allowed 10% reserves on each level, excuse me, I have to go to this. while the law and custom allow 10% reserves on each level, it could permit an increase of deposits equivalent to $2,065 on the uppermost level. If such an ounce of gold were withdrawn from a fully expanded pyramid of money, this would compel a reduction of deposits, and by at least this amount, probably by a refusal to renew loans. Throughout modern history, the influence of gold has been deflationary, because the natural output of gold each year, except in extraordinary times, has not kept pace with the increase in output of goods. Only new supplies of gold, or the suspension of the gold standard in wartime, or the development of new kinds of money, like notes and checks, which economize the use of gold, have saved our civilization from steady price deflation over the last couple of centuries. As it was, we had two long periods of such deflation, from 1818 to 1850, and from 1872 to about 1897. The three surrounding periods of inflation, 1790 to 1817, 1850 to 1872, and 1897 to 1921, were cause 1, the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, when most countries were not on gold; 2. The new gold strikes of California and Alaska in 1849 to 1850, followed by a series of wars which included the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, the Austrian-French War of 1859, the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the Austro-Prussian and Franco-Prussian Wars of 1866 and 1870, and even the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, and 3. The Klondike and Transvaal gold strikes of the late 1890s, supplemented by the new cyanide method of refining gold about 1897, and the series of wars from the Spanish-American War of 1898 to 1899, the Boer War 1899 to 1902, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, to the almost uninterrupted series of wars in the decade 1911 to 1921. In each case, the three great periods of war ended with an extreme deflationary crisis: 1819, 1873, 1921, as the influential money power persuaded governments to re-establish a deflationary monetary unit with a high gold content. The obsession of the money power with deflation was partly a result of their concern with money rather than with goods, but was also founded on other factors, one of which was paradoxical. The paradox arose from the fact that the basic economic conditions of the 19th century were deflationary, with a money system based on gold and an industrial system pouring out increasing supplies of goods, but in spite of falling prices with its increasing value of money, the interest rate tended to fall rather than to rise. This occurred because the relative limiting of the supply of money in business was not reflected in the world of finance, where excess profits of finance made excess funds available for lending. Moreover, the old traditions of merchant banking continued to prevail in financial capitalism even to its end in 1931. It continued to emphasize bonds rather than equity securities, stocks, to favor government issues rather than private offerings, and to look to foreign rather than to domestic investments. Until 1825, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities on the London Stock Exchange. In 1843, such bonds, usually foreign, were 80% of the securities registered, and in 1875 they were still 68%. The funds available for such loans were so great that there were in the 19th century sometimes riots by subscribers seeking opportunities to buy security flotations, and offerings from many remote places and obscure activities commanded a ready sale. The excess of savings led to a fall in the price necessary to hire money, so that the interest rate on British government bonds fell from 4.42% in 1820 to 3.11 in 1850 to 2.76 in 1900. This tended to drive savings into foreign fields where, on the whole, they continued to seek government issues and fixed interest securities. All this served to strengthen the merchant bankers' obsession both with the government influence and with the deflation, which would increase value of money and interest rates. Another paradox of banking practice arose from the fact that bankers, who loved deflation, often acted in an inflationary fashion from their eagerness to lend money at interest. Since they make money out of loans, they are eager to increase the amounts of bank credit on loan, but this is inflationary. The conflict between the deflationary ideas and inflationary practices of bankers had profound repercussions on business. The bankers made loans to business so that the volume of money increased faster than the increase in goods. The result was inflation. When this became clearly noticeable, the bankers would flee to notes or specie by curtailing credit and raising discount rates. This was beneficial to bankers in the short run, since it allowed them to foreclose on collateral held for loans, but it could be disastrous to them in the long run by forcing the value of the collateral below the amount of the loans it secured. But such bankers' deflation was destructive to business and industry in the short run as well as the long run. The resulting fluctuation in the supply of money, chiefly deposits, was a prominent aspect of the business cycle. The quantity of money could be changed by changing reserve requirements or discount interest rates. In the United States, for example, an upper limit has been set on deposits by requiring Federal Reserve member banks to keep a certain percentage of their deposits as reserves with the local Federal Reserve Bank. The percentage, usually from 7 to 26%, varies from the locality and the decisions of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Central banks can usually vary the amount of money in circulation by open market operations, or by influencing the discount rates of lesser banks. In open market operations, a central bank buys or sells government bonds in the open market. If it buys, it releases money into the economic system. If it sells, it reduces the amount of money in the community. The change is greater than the price paid for the securities. For example, if the Federal Reserve Bank buys government securities in the open market, it pays for these by check, which is soon deposited in a bank. It thus increases this bank's reserves with the Federal Reserve Bank. Since banks are permitted to issue loans for several times the value of their reserves with the Federal Reserve Bank, such a transaction permits them to issue loans for a much larger sum. Central banks can also change the quantity of money by influencing the credit policies of other banks. This can be done by various methods, such as changing the rediscount rate or changing reserve requirements. By changing the rediscount rate, we mean the interest rate which central banks charge lesser banks for loans backed by commercial paper or other security which these lesser banks have taken in return for loans. By raising the rediscount rate, the central bank forces the lesser bank to raise its discount rate in order to operate at a profit. Such a raise in interest rates tends to reduce the demand for credit and thus the amount of deposits, money. Lowering the rediscount rate permits an opposite result. Changing the reserve requirements as a method by which central banks can influence the credit policies of other banks is possible only in those places, like the United States, where there is a statutory limit on reserves. Increasing reserve requirements curtails the ability of lesser banks to grant credit, while decreasing it expands that ability. It is to be noted that the control of the central bank over the credit policies of local banks are permissive in one direction and compulsive in the other. They can compel these local banks to curtail credit and can only permit them to increase credit. This means that they have control powers against inflation and not deflation, a reflection of the old banking idea that inflation was bad and deflation was good. The powers of governments over the quantity of money are of various kinds, and include A. Control over a central bank, B. Control over public taxation, and C. Control over public spending. The control of governments over central banks varies greatly from one country to another, but on the whole has been increasing. Since most central banks have been technically private institutions, this control is frequently based on custom rather than on law. In any case, the control over the supply of money which governments have through central banks is exercised by the regular banking procedures we have discussed. The powers of the government over the quantity of money in the community, exercised through taxation and public spending, are largely independent of banking control. Taxation tends to reduce the amount of money in a community and is usually a deflationary force. Government spending tends to increase the amount of money in a community and is usually an inflationary force. The total effects of a government's policy will depend on which item is greater. An unbalanced budget will be inflationary, a budget with a surplus will be deflationary. A government can also change the amount of money in a community by other, more drastic methods. By changing the gold content of the monetary unit, they can change the amount of money in the community by a much greater amount. If, for example, the gold content of the dollar is cut in half, the amount of gold certificates will be able to be doubled, and the amount of notes and deposits reared on this basis will be increased manifold, depending on the customs of the community in respect to reserve requirements. Moreover, if a government goes off the gold standard completely, that is, refuses to exchange certificates and notes for specie, the amount of notes and deposits can be increased indefinitely, because they are no longer limited by limited amounts of gold reserves. In the various sections which increase or decrease the supply of money, governments, bankers, and industrialists have not always seen eye to eye. On the whole, in the period up to 1931, bankers, especially the money power, controlled by the international investment bankers, were able to dominate both business and government. They could dominate business especially in activities and in areas where industry could not finance its own needs for capital, because investment bankers had the ability to supply or refuse to supply such capital. Thus, Rothschild interests came to dominate many of the railroads of Europe, while Morgan dominated at least 26,000 miles of American railroads. Such bankers went further than this. In return for flotations of securities of industry, they took seats on the boards of directors of industrial firms, and they had already done on commercial banks, savings banks, insurance firms, and finance companies. From these lesser institutions they funneled capital to enterprises which yielded control and away from those who resisted. These firms were controlled through interlocking directorships, holding companies and lesser banks. They engineered amalgamations and generally reduced competition, until by the early 20th century many activities were so monopolized that they could raise their non-competitive prices above costs to obtain sufficient profits to become self-financing, and were thus able to eliminate the control of bankers. But before that stage was reached, a relatively small number of bankers were in positions of immense influence in European and American economic life. As early as 1909, Walter Rathenau, who was in a position to know, since he had inherited from his father control of the German General Electric Company and held scores of directorships himself, said, 300 men, all of whom know one another, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves. The power of investment bankers over governments rests on a number of factors, of which the most significant, perhaps, is the need of governments to issue short-term treasury bills as well as long-term government bonds. Just as businessmen go to commercial banks for current capital advances to smooth over the discrepancies between their irregular and intermittent incomes and their periodic and persistent outgoes, such as monthly rents, annual mortgage payments, and weekly wages, so a government has to go to merchant bankers, or institutions controlled by them, to tide over the shallow places caused by irregular tax receipts. As experts in government bonds, the international bankers not only handled the necessary advances, but provided advice to government officials, and on many occasions placed their own members in official posts for varied periods to deal with special problems. This is so widely accepted even today that in 1961 a Republican investment banker became Secretary of the Treasury in a Democratic administration in Washington, without significant comment from any direction. Naturally, the influence of bankers over governments during the age of financial capitalism, roughly 1850 to 1931, was not something about which anyone talked freely, but it has been admitted frequently enough by those on the inside, especially in England. In 1852 Gladstone, Chancellor of the Exchequer, declared, "The hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." On September 26, 1921, the Financial Times wrote, "Half a dozen men at the top of the big five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills." In 1924, Sir Drummond Fraser, Vice President of the Institute of Bankers, stated, "The Governor of the Bank of England..." What? Just a moment, there is a problem here. The Governor of the Bank of England must be the autocrat who dictates the terms upon which alone the government can obtain borrowed money. In addition to their power over government based on government financing and personal influence, bankers could steer governments in ways they wish them to go by other pressures. Since most government officials felt ignorant of finance, they sought advice from bankers whom they considered to be experts in the field. The history of the last century shows, as we shall see later, that the advice given to governments by bankers, like the advice they gave to industrialists, was consistently good for bankers, but was often disastrous for governments, businessmen, and the people generally. Such advice could be enforced if necessary by manipulation of exchanges, gold flows, discount rates, and even levels of business activity. Thus Morgan dominated Cleveland's second administration by gold withdrawals, and in 1936 to 1938, foreign exchange manipulators paralyzed the Popular Front government. As we shall see, the powers of these international bankers reached their peak in the last decade of their supremacy, 1919 to 1931, when Montague Norman and J.P. Morgan dominated not only the financial world but international relations and other matters as well. On November 11, 1927, the Wall Street Journal called Mr. Norman the currency dictator of Europe. This was admitted by Mr. Norman himself before the court of the bank on March 21, 1930, and before the Macmillan Committee of the House of Commons 5 days later. On one occasion, just before international financial capitalism ran at full speed on the rocks which sank it, Mr. Norman is reported to have said, "I hail the hegemony of the world." At the time, some Englishmen spoke of the second Norman conquest of England, in reference to the fact that Norman's brother was head of the British Broadcasting Corporation. It might be added that Governor Norman rarely acted in major world problems without consulting with J.P. Morgan's representatives, and as a consequence he was one of the most widely travelled men of his day. The conflict of interest between bankers and industrialists has resulted in most European countries in the subordination of the former either to the latter or to the government after 1931. This subordination was accomplished by the adoption of unorthodox financial policies, that is, financial policies not in accordance with the short-run interests of bankers. This shift by which bankers were made subordinate reflected a fundamental development in modern economic history, a development which can be described as the growth from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism. This took place in Germany earlier than in any other country, and was well underway by 1926. It came to Britain only after 1931 and in Italy only in 1934. It did not occur in France to a comparable extent at all, and this explains the economic weakness of France in 1938 to 1940 to a considerable degree. The financial principles which apply to the relationships between different countries are an expansion of those which apply within a single country. When goods are exchanged between countries, they must be paid for by commodities or gold. They cannot be paid for by the notes, certificates, and checks of the purchaser's country, since these are of value only in the country of issue. To avoid shipment of gold with every purchase, bills of exchange are used. These are claims against a person in another country which are sold to a person in the same country. The latter will buy such a claim if he wants to satisfy a claim against himself held by a person in the other country. He can satisfy such a claim by sending to his creditor in the other country the claim which he has bought against another person in that other country, and let his creditor use that claim to satisfy his own claim. Thus, instead of importers in one country sending money to exporters in another country, importers in one country pay their debts to exporters in their own country, and their creditors in the other country receive payment for the goods they have exported from importers in their own country. Thus, payment for goods in an international trade is made by merging single transactions involving two persons into double transactions involving four persons. In many cases, payment is made by involving a multitude of transactions, frequently in several different countries. These transactions were carried on in the so-called foreign exchange market. An exporter of goods sold bills of exchange into that market, and thus drew out of it money in his own country's units. An importer bought such bills of exchange to send to his creditor, and thus he put his own country's monetary units into the market. Since the bills available in any market are drawn into monetary units of many different foreign countries, there arose exchange relationships between the amounts of money available in the country's own units, put there by importers, and the variety of bills drawn in foreign monies and put into the market by exporters. The supply and demand for bills or money of any country in terms of the supply and demand of the country's own money available in the foreign exchange market determined the value of the other country's monies in relation to domestic money. These values could fluctuate widely for countries not on the gold standard, but only narrowly, as we shall see, for those in gold. Under normal conditions, a foreign exchange market served to pay for goods and services of foreigners without any international shipment of money, gold. It also acted as a regulator of international trade. If the imports of any country steadily exceeded exports to another country, more importers would be in the market offering domestic money for bills of exchange drawn in the money of their foreign creditor. There thus would be an increased supply of domestic money and an increased demand for that foreign money. As a result, importers would have to offer more of their money for these foreign bills, and the value of domestic money would fall, while the value of the foreign money would rise in the foreign exchange market. This rise or fall on a gold relationship would be measured in terms of par, the exact gold content equivalent of the two currencies. As the value of the domestic currency sagged below par in relationship to that of some foreign currency, domestic exporters to that foreign country will increase their activities, because when they receive payment in the form of a bill of exchange, they can sell it for more of their own currency than they usually expect, and can thus increase their profits. A surplus of imports, by lowering the foreign exchange value of the importing country's money, will lead eventually to an increase in exports, which, by providing more bills of exchange, will tend to restore the relationship of the monies back toward par. Such a restoration of parity in foreign exchange will reflect a restoration of balance in international obligations, and this in turn will reflect a restored balance in the exchange of goods and services between the two countries. This means, under normal conditions, that a trade disequilibrium will create trade conditions which will tend to restore trade equilibrium. When countries are not on the gold standard, this foreign exchange disequilibrium, that is, the decline in the value of the monetary unit in relation to the other unit, can go on to very wide fluctuations, in fact, to whatever degree is necessary to restore the trade equilibrium by encouraging importers to buy in the other country, because its money is so low in value that the prices of goods in that country are irresistible to importers in the other country. But when countries are on the gold standard, the result is quite different. In this case, the value of a country's money will never go below the amount equal to the cost of shipping gold between the two countries. An importer who wishes to pay his trade partner in the other country will not offer more and more of his own country's money for foreign exchange bills, but will bid up the price of such bills only to the point where it becomes cheaper for him to buy gold from a bank and pay the costs of shipping and insurance on the gold as it goes to his foreign creditor. Thus, on the gold standard, foreign exchange quotations do not fluctuate widely, but move only between the two gold points, which are only slightly above gold export point and slightly below gold import point parity. The legal gold relationship of the two currencies. Since the cost of packing, shipping, and insuring gold used to be about 0.5% of its value, the gold export and import points were about this amount above or below the parity point. In the case of the dollar-pound relationship, when parity was at $1 equals 4.866, 1 pound equals 4.866. The gold export point was about 4.885, and the gold import point was about 4.845. Thus, gold export point 4.885, excess demand for bills by importers, parity 4.866, gold import point 4.845, excess supply of bills by exporters. The situation which we have described is overly simplified. In practice, the situation is made more complicated by several factors. Among these are the following. Middlemen buy and sell foreign exchange for present or future delivery as a speculative activity. The total supply of foreign exchange available in the market depends on much more than the international exchange of commodities. It depends on the sum total of all international payments, such as interest, payment for services, tourist spending, borrowings, sales of securities, immigrant remittances, and so on. 3. The total exchange balance depends on the total of the relationships of all countries, not merely between two. The flow of gold from country to country resulting from unbalanced trade tends to create a situation which counteracts the flow. If a country exports more than it imports, so that gold flows in to cover the difference, this gold will become the basis for an increased quantity of money, and this will cause a raise of prices within the country sufficient to reduce exports and increase imports. At the same time, the gold, by flowing out of some other country, will reduce the quantity of money there and will cause a fall in prices within that country. These shifts in prices will cause shifts in the flow of goods because of the obvious fact that goods tend to flow to higher priced areas and cease to flow to lower priced areas. These shifts in the flow of goods will counteract the original imbalance in trade which caused the flow of gold. As a result, the flow of gold will cease, and a balanced international trade at slightly different price levels will result. The whole process illustrates the subordination of internal price stability to stability of exchanges. It was this subordination which was rejected by most countries after 1931. This rejection was signified by a. abandonment of the gold standard, at least in part, and b. efforts at control of domestic prices, and c. efforts at exchange control. All these were done because of a desire to free the economic system from the restricting influence of a gold-dominated financial system. This wonderful automatic mechanism of international payments represents one of the greatest social instruments ever devised by man. It requires, however, a very special group of conditions for its effective functioning, and as we shall see now, these conditions were disappearing by 1900 and were largely wiped away as a result of the economic changes brought about by the First World War. Because of these changes, it became impossible to restore the financial system which had existed before 1914. Efforts to restore it were made with great determination, but by 1933 they had obviously failed, and all major countries had been forced to abandon the gold standard and automatic exchanges. When the gold standard is abandoned, gold flows between countries like any other commodity, and the value of foreign exchanges, no longer tied to gold, can fluctuate much more widely. In theory, an imbalance of international payments can be rectified either through a shift in exchange rates or through a shift in internal price levels. On the gold standard, this rectification is made by shifts in exchange rates only between the gold points. When the imbalance is so great that exchanges will be forced beyond the gold points, the rectification is made by means of changing internal prices caused by the fact that gold flows at the gold points instead of the exchanges passing below the gold points. On the other hand, when a currency is off the gold standard, fluctuation of exchanges is not confined between any 2 points, but can go indefinitely in either direction. In such a case, the imbalance of international payments is worked out largely by a shift in exchange rates and only remotely by shifts in internal prices. In the period of 1929 to 1936, the countries of the world went off gold because they preferred to bring their international balances toward equilibrium by means of fluctuating exchanges rather than by means of fluctuating price levels. They feared these last because changing, especially falling prices, led to declines in business activity and shifts in the utilization of economic resources such as labor, land, and capital from one activity to another. The re-establishment of the balance of international payments when a currency is off gold can be seen from an example. If the value of the pound sterling falls to $4 or $3, Americans will buy in England increasingly because English prices are cheap for them, but Englishmen will buy in America only with reluctance because they have to pay so much for American money. This will serve to rectify the original excess of exports to England, which gave the great supply of pound sterling necessary to drive its value down to $3. Such a depreciation in the exchange value of a currency will cause a rise in prices within the country as a result of the increase in demand for the goods of that country. The situation before 1914. The key to the world situation in the period before 1914 is to be found in the dominant position of Great Britain. This position was more real than apparent. In many fields, such as naval or financial, the supremacy of Britain was so complete that it almost never had to be declared by her or admitted by others. It was tacitly assumed by both. As an unchallenged ruler in these fields, Britain could afford to be a benevolent ruler. Sure of herself and of her position, she could be satisfied with substance rather than forms. If others accepted her dominance in fact, she was quite willing to leave them to them independence and autonomy in law. This supremacy of Britain was not an achievement of the 19th century alone. Its origins go back to the 16th century, to the period in which the discovery of America made the Atlantic more important than the Mediterranean, as a road to commerce and a road to wealth. In the Atlantic, Britain's position was unique, not merely because of her westernmost position, but much more because she was an island. This last fact made it possible for her to watch Europe embroil itself in internal squabbles, while she retained freedom to exploit the new worlds across the seas. On this basis, Britain had built up a naval supremacy which made her a ruler of the seas by 1900. Along with this was her preeminence in merchant shipping, which gave her control of the avenues of world transportation and ownership of 39% of the world's ocean-going vessels, 3 times the number of her nearest rival. To her supremacy in these spheres, won in the period before 1815, Britain added new spheres of dominance in the period after 1815. These arose from her early achievement of the Industrial Revolution. This was applied to transportation and communications as well as to industrial production. In the first, it gave the world the railroad and the steamboat. In the second, it gave the telegraph, the cable, and the telephone. In the third, it gave the factory system. The Industrial Revolution existed in Britain for almost 2 generations before it spread elsewhere. It gave a great increase in output of manufactured goods and a great demand for raw materials and food. It also gave a great increase in wealth and savings. As a result of the first two and the improved methods of transportation, Britain developed a world trade of which it was the center, and which consisted chiefly of the export of manufactured goods and the import of raw materials and food. At the same time, the savings of Britain tended to flow out to North America, South America, and Asia, seeking to increase the output of raw materials and food in these areas. By 1914, these exports of capital had reached such an amount that they were greater than the foreign investments of all other countries put together. In 1914, British overseas investment was about $20 billion, or about 1/4 of Britain's national wealth, yielding about 1/10 of the total national income. The French overseas investment at the same time was about $9 billion, or 1/6 the French national wealth, yielding 6% of the national income, while Germany had about $5 billion invested overseas, 1/15 the national wealth, yielding 3% of the national income. The United States at that time was a large-scale debtor. The dominant position of Britain in the world of 1913 was, as I have said, more real than apparent. In all parts of the world, people slept more securely, worked more productively, and lived more fully because Britain existed. British naval vessels in the Indian Ocean and the Far East suppressed slave raiders, pirates, and headhunters. Small nations like Portugal, the Netherlands, or Belgium retained their overseas possessions under the protection of the British fleet. Even the United States, without realizing it, remained secure and upheld the Monroe Doctrine behind the shield of the British Navy. Small nations were able to preserve their independence in the gaps between the great powers, kept in precarious balance by the Foreign Office's rather diffident balance of power tactics. Most of the world's great commercial markets, even in commodities like cotton, rubber, and tin, which she did not produce in quantities herself, were in England, the world price being set from the auction bidding of skilled specialist traders there. If a man in Peru wished to send money to a man in Afghanistan, the final payment, as like as not, would be made by a bookkeeping transaction in London. The English parliamentary system and some aspects of the English judicial system, such as the rule of law, were being copied, as best as could be, in all parts of the world. The profitability of capital outside Britain, a fact which caused a great export of capital, was matched by a profitability of labor. As a result, the flow of capital from Britain and Europe was matched by a flow of persons. Both of these served to build up non-European areas on a modified European pattern. In export of men, as in export of capital, Britain was easily first. Over 20 million persons emigrating from the United Kingdom in the period 1850 to 1938. As a result of both, Britain became the center of world finance, as well as the center of world commerce. The system of international financial relations, which we described earlier, was based on the system of industrial, commercial, and credit relations which we have just described. The former thus required for its existence a very special group of circumstances, a group which could not be expected to continue forever. In addition, it required a group of secondary characteristics which were also far from permanent. Among these were the following. 1. All the countries concerned must be on the full gold standard. 2. There must be freedom from public or private interference with the domestic economy of any country. That is, prices must be free to rise and fall, in accordance with the supply and demand for both goods and money. 3. There must also be free flow of international trade, so that both goods and money can go without hindrance to those areas where each is most valuable. 4. The international financial economy must be organized about one center, with numerous subordinate centers, so that it would be possible to cancel out international claims against one another in some clearing-house, and thus to reduce the flow of gold to a minimum. 5. The flow of goods and funds in international matters should be controlled by economic factors and not be subject to political, psychological, or ideological influences. These conditions, which made the international financial and commercial system function so beautifully before 1914, had begun to change by 1890. The fundamental economic and commercial conditions changed first and were noticeably modified by 1910. The group of secondary characteristics of the system were changed by the events of the First World War. As a result, the system of early international financial capitalism is now only a dim memory. Imagine a period without passports or visas, and with almost no immigration or customs restrictions. Certainly the system had many incidental drawbacks, but they were incidental. Socialized if not social, civilized if not cultured, the system allowed its individuals to breathe freely and develop their individual talents in a way unknown before and in jeopardy since.